Hi, welcome back, and today we have a fifth lesson which you can see is titled Priorities, Options, Scenarios in Project Success. That sounds quite a lot, but I'm going to just select something that introduces you to the issue and give you some readings as a start for you for further individual study. Actually, in this lesson we make a bit of a summary of the lessons before and start from there. So, what we have? We have discussed about the vicious circle that leads to crisis because of lack of solutions in socio-economic systems. We have these conflicting priorities between public and scientific and technical systems. We have the situations of blockage and so on. It is also hard in these times of technological explosion to anticipate which niche technology will actually win or dominate in the future. And in general, it is hard to plan anything which makes that bad situations will aggravate and are aggravating. I will come back to that. Also, in the story we have to know and to remember that communities in general are defined in a different way by each expert from different fields. Remember, from sociology, from engineering and so on. Then we have the problem of science that needs to reinvent itself and generate this new social contract for science and scientists. Then we have these big interdependencies between human and natural systems. Then we have our main goal, which is prosperity for all of us, and we are already so many billions. Each of us wants this prosperity on this little planet with the same rights to have that prosperity. Then our communities, cities and villages, all communities have a dual character: local, being embedded in local biogeochemical situation and cultural history, and also global character through the interactions that the community has with all the other communities around the globe. And then when you have a project of development, you have actors that are very different, coming from science, industry and government. And in business we have the issue of big data, the deluge of data. And research says that managers want from their data especially these things: integration, consistency, trustworthiness, simplification and timeliness. So, it's a lot, isn't it? So, how do we deal with that? First, unfortunately, we have to make an observation. It's really true and sad, and we always try to avoid it, but it's like that for the moment. When it is about big problems, it seems that it takes a disaster to make people do something about that problem. Why? This is our question. Before I'm going to why, I want to just introduce briefly to you these two situations, and I give you the hyperlinks on Wikipedia, which includes very nice articles about these two problems, and you can familiarize yourself with these and then continue with other situations. First is the destruction of New Orleans in 2005 after the Hurricane Katrina. Now, this is a typical situation in which people were confronted with a complex context and problem, and the beginning of the solution was postponed so long. And then when something happened, they were left without any protection. You will see when you read yourself that New Orleans is, as you probably know, located in southern United States, and on the delta of Mississippi, on a lowland that is very prone to flooding. And in the mid-60s already, there was a project approved starting to create an infrastructure that would protect the city, dikes and so on. After 50 years, works were not finished. In 2001, I think, a few years before, big journalists were saying, you know what, New Orleans is a big disaster waiting to happen. And it happened a few years later. Then also people were thinking, okay, we'll have these dikes, so we are protected. There will be no serious flooding here because we have the dikes, right? Big dikes. But nobody thought that the dikes might break. So what happens after that? Well, the works were not finished. The dikes broke. So everybody was left unprepared. There comes the disaster. And also the reaction of the people after that tells a lot about the functioning of the socio-economic system. So this is a good example that you should follow for your own learning and draw your own lessons. Now, a second case is Germany, and it's related to Japan, because if you remember, a few years ago we had the Fukushima disaster, where some events collaborated to create this nuclear disaster. And Germany, or the German people, said, okay, we also have a lot of nuclear energy. We are dependent on that because we are a very industrialized country. And this is what happened in Japan, also a very powerful and industrialized country with a lot of economic strength. So our own nuclear plants are a disaster waiting to happen. So they decided, short after this event in Japan, to give up the nuclear energy, and instead of getting free of nuclear energy in 2036, I think, they decided to get rid of it in 2022, much faster. And now they engaged, the Germans, into what they call a transition to a new type of energy, so energetic transition. That's another example that you should read and try to draw your own lessons. Now, in the process, what happens? Why we have this sort of necessity that the disaster happens before people act? Well, you know, complexity, hard decision, acceptability of decision by many people. If there are so many actors and stakeholders, not everybody will be happy, so it takes long, and maybe the decision is not taken, and so on. Then responsibility related to that, and the cost of it. The bigger it is, the higher the cost it is. And you know, if the cost is very high, people will say, oh, are we obliged to do that right now? Maybe not. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Come on. Wrong attitude. Then the perception of priorities is not the same before and after the disaster. Before a disaster, people don't really believe it will happen to them. After the disaster, why didn't you do something about it? And they, you know, finger point to local authorities and anyone that you could blame. So the attitude and the perceptions change completely. This is why they act differently after the disaster. And a third issue is that during normal time, everybody has its own time. Planning, they don't coordinate, each one with their own business. But when such a big disaster hits and everybody is affected, this is a sort of reset for everybody. So this is the moment when they are forced to coordinate. So this is basically when something becomes possible. It doesn't mean that we need a disaster. We can force ourselves to create our own adjustments and coordination for good timing. But this is what happens. These are the issues. What are the solutions? As you already guessed, it's creating dialogues, two types of dialogues, between experts, so that they can learn from each other and collectively what are the options, and then with advantages and disadvantages, and then the dialogue between communities of experts and citizens for collaborative learning between these two communities.